Ross Montgomery is a former primary teacher. His first novel, Alex, the Dog and the Unopenable Door, was published by Faber in 2013, and it was nominated for the Costa Children's Book of the Year Award and the Bramford Bows. Further novels included The Tornado Chasers, Perigee and Me, Christmas Dinner of Souls, and Max and the Millions. He's also written two poignant picture books, The Building Boy and Space Tortoise, both beautifully illustrated by David Litchfield. His latest novel, The Midnight Guardians, published by Walker Books, is set during the London Blitz, and it weaves together a historical story with a mythic quest of good versus evil. I'm delighted today to welcome into the Reading Corner Ross Montgomery.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start actually with a question that might seem a little bit off the wall. I'm going to start with Christmas because I'm beginning to think that you're obsessed with Christmas. You've written about it before, and what is it that makes this time of the year so special to you?
I've noticed it over particularly the last few weeks that when things begin to get a little bit darker and colder, my whole body just breathes a sigh of relief. I think I just naturally feel more comfortable with autumn and winter, and I've never gotten over the sense of something building over December and feeling like something really exciting is going to happen. I think it always ends up being the time of year where I feel most excited about writing stuff down. And I think in the past, I've turned that into sort of scary Christmassy stories with Christmas Dinner of Souls. But I think with this book, I really wanted to try and capture that sense of, even if everything is maybe a little bit quiet and a little bit dark, that something very important is going to happen. I think that's sort of a seed that gets planted a bit when you're a child and then never quite leaves.
It's interesting. I needed to talk a bit of Christmas with you. You know, as I'm recording with you today, we're in a second lockdown leading up to what might be an unusual Christmas. Indeed. And hopefully it gives people lots of chance to do some reading. And of course, a good choice would be your new book, The Midnight Guardians. So we're going to talk about this, which is, it's fair to say, it's a book that has a lot going on. It's about a young boy called Cole who's been evacuated to Buxton in Derbyshire following the death of his father. His sister remains behind in London, which is undergoing the Blitz, which is this relentless bombing campaign. And that's where the story starts. And Christmas is coming, and Cole discovers and is very disappointed that his sister, who he wants to be reunited with, is not coming to Buxton, but is staying in London to help during the air raids. That's the beginning of the story. But in terms of, as I say, there's a lot going on and we'll get the chance to explore all of that. How would you sum it up?
I think that you're absolutely right. And it is a book that mixes together several different things. And I think part of the challenge of writing it was trying to strike the balance between them. I would say that at its heart, this is a sort of classic feeling children's book. I wanted to have a go writing a book that almost in some respects could feel like it was written decades ago, and that would be about sort of light and dark and good and evil, and sort of shot through with absolutely shed loads of British mythology. But I also did want to try and have a go tackling it in a slightly different way, and finding, if I could, sort of almost new things to talk about within it. But I think at heart, I like the idea of writing a book that was very much like the ones that I used to read.
Fantastic. We'll come back to that mythological strand and how you did manage to weave it all together and the craft of how you dealt with that. Just as you've mentioned the classic feel to the book, I wanted to add that as I read it, I could have been reading The Box of Delights. I felt that the central character felt like Kay, and it did feel like a period piece. I felt there were possibly other children's book influences going on. I got a slightly Pratchett-esque feel from some of the fairies, for instance. Is Pratchett a fan, not a fan of yours? Are you a fan of Pratchett?
Only, that's amazing. No, I completely. I was a big Discworld fan. I mean, I still am, but I think that those Terry Pratchett books. I think I started reading them when I was maybe 10, and I just didn't realize the books could do that. I didn't realize that you could write stories that were funny but also really moving at the same time as being ambitious and weird. I think that was probably the moment when I think I realized that was something I wanted to do, that I wanted to like have a try to write stuff that would make other people feel the way those books would make me feel.
There are some lovely moments of humour in there. There's a moment where the King of the Fairies goes to have a bath in frog spawn, and I kind of did laugh quite a bit at that point. And I had not only the visual, I could imagine the sensations of it all. But let's talk now about the story itself. So I've introduced Cole a little bit, and he's really going on an adventure quest, isn't he? So
Absolutely.
He starts off going to find his sister, and then he arrives at his childhood home. Mm-hmm. What happens there?
Well, when Cole first arrives, he's really going because he feels like there's nowhere else that he can go. He wants to find a way to feel close to his family again, to his sister who he knows he can't see, and to his father who he lost fairly recently. He expects an empty cottage, but when he gets there, he discovers his guardians are waiting for him. They're his 3 imaginary friends from childhood, just characters that he made up. And he thought he'd completely forgotten about, but it turns out they haven't forgotten about him. They have come to life to give him a dire message.
I would love it, Ross, if you would read the part of the book where he meets his guardians for the first time.
Oh, absolutely. So something I should have mentioned, of course, about these guardians is that there are 3 of them. There is Pendlebury, who is a giant shape-shifting Bengal tiger who's not very good at telling jokes. There is Mr. Noakes, who is a sort of cuddly badger in a waistcoat with a very good sense of smell. And there is the King of Rogues, who is a courageous and fearless knight, but he's about 4 feet tall and has a serious attitude problem. And here's the moment when Cole steps into his attic and realizes for the first time that they're there. Cole stared at his imaginary friends. The guardians were exactly as he'd always imagined them. Pendlebury, the tiger, was sleek and mysterious, a creature woven from stars and midnight. Mr. Noakes, the badger, was moth-eaten and burly, like an affable old man in a country pub. The knight, the King of Rogues, was all bug eyes and wonky limbs, more of a puppet than a person. But now they weren't imaginary. They were real. They were talking and moving in front of him like real people. And their colours. Since the war began, the world had been all ration book greys and blacks, weak tea and burned toast. Winter had drained the life from everything. And yet the guardians were so bright, so vivid. They almost seemed to shimmer in the air. Cole was utterly speechless. The King of Rogues suddenly threw himself to the floor in front of him, sounding like a stack of tin cans being chucked down a staircase. "My liege! I never once doubted you would come." He bowed his head over his sword. "We, your loyal guardians, have returned to our place of making to fulfill our sacred duty," and Mr. Noakes bustled him to one side. "Oh, leave off! Poor lad can't understand a word you're saying." He stood in front of Cole and beamed furrily. "What an honour to finally see you in the flesh, Master Cole. You've become quite the young gentleman, I see. Look at you all dressed up in your fine monkey suit." Pendlebury poured herself down from the rafters. "Boys, please, give Cole some room. This must be a lot for him to take in. After all, he's never seen us like this before. Have you, Cole?" Cole yelped. The tiger's tail had reached behind him and was tickling him on the cheek. "What's going on?" he cried. "What's happening?" The guardian's smiles dropped. "Is he frightened?" said the King of Rogues. "He doesn't seem very happy to see us," said Mr. Noakes. Cole shook his head like a dog trying to dry itself. This was all too much. There was no way that his imaginary friends were standing in front of him in his attic. "This isn't happening. It's not real. I'll close my eyes, and when I open them again, you'll be gone." He closed his eyes, counted to 5, and opened them again. His guardians were still standing in front of him, looking even more confused than before. "Ah!" said Cole. "He is frightened," said Mr. Noakes. "Of course he's frightened," snapped the King of Rogues. "You're standing 2 inches in front of his face, and she's the size of a dragon. For heaven's sake, Pendlebury, make yourself presentable." The tiger raised an eyebrow. The knight gulped. If you wouldn't mind," he added. There was a short, sharp sound like the ripping of stitches, and then Pendlebury was the size of a regular tiger, without anyone knowing quite how she'd done it. "Better?" she said. Maybe a little smaller," suggested the King of Rogues. "No," said Pendlebury. Cole stared at the tiger in shock. He could see every strand of her fur shifting and swaying in the candlelight. There was no doubting it. She was as real as he was. She turned to face him and spoke. "Do not be frightened, Cole. It's us, your guardians, your lifelong friends and protectors. We've broken all the laws of our kind to come to your world and bring you dire news. There is much that will shock you, much you will struggle to believe, but you must believe, Cole. If you do not, then all is lost." And that's about as far as I'm going to read in that chapter. That's all you get.
Well, that's enough to entice us into the story, that's for sure. Now, these 3 characters, these guardians, that are products of Cole's imagination, of course, are products of your imagination too. And I've never met a more unlikely group of 3 friends. Now, where on earth did they come from?
I've had to really think about this because when I first sketched down the idea for the book, even before I knew that I wanted to set it in 1940, the very, very, very first thing I ever wrote down was those 3 characters. And I remember at the time just kind of pulling them out of my head in like, yeah, something like this and something like this and something like this. And I do that a lot. You know, I'll sort of write down an idea, but then I'll change it lots. But those 3 just ended up staying. And I don't know if that just comes from a place of almost like a gut instinct feeling that, yeah, I wanted these 3 contrasting characters, and I like the idea of riding on a tiger. I thought that'd be like really good. The only thing that I did change was when I first wrote the character of Pendlebury the tiger, it was that she was based on a porcelain model. So she was made of porcelain. And as they went on the journey, they would have to find plates to feed her. And my agent had a very strict word with me and said, "Don't do that. That is weird. Just make it a tiger." I do think that I can trace almost like where each idea possibly came from. I mean, that China tiger, I do remember as a child, I bought a tiny porcelain mouse that was about as big as my fingernail. It was absolutely tiny. And I think the idea of having this China tiger that could, Pendlebury can change size very quickly. So I think that idea of being able to go to something that small came from almost that idea, this tiny little China mouse. But otherwise, I mean, Mr. Noakes, the badger, I'm really not 100% sure where that came from. I think it reminds me a lot of maybe my grandfather's house. He'd sort of had things like big stuffed toys of foxes wearing fox hunting uniforms, which is horrible. And the King of Rogues, to be honest, is just a straight up act of plagiarization from the film Labyrinth. He's just based on Sir Didymus, that sort of strange furry sheepdog riding knight, just because that was a huge film in my childhood.
Interesting. So let's deal a little bit with the historical side of the story. First of all, it's set, as we said at the beginning, during the Blitz. Why that particular period?
I think that it's something that had been building in my head for a long time. When I was a primary school teacher, I worked in Bethnal Green, and that area, you have a lot of reminders of how heavily it was bombed during the Blitz. And I think that, I mean, I was brought up being taught about the Second World War and the Blitz. And I think I started to realize for the first time that it was an actual real thing that happened. And it wasn't just a story that we tell people about, a thing that happened. People really were living in a city that was, or, you know, cities all over the UK that were being bombed almost every single night. and then they'd get up the next day and go to work. And I think the absolute implausibility of that was the thing that really grabbed me. Of, well, if you're coming out of a shelter at 6 a.m. to potentially find that all of the houses on your street have been destroyed, how do you go to work at that point? It doesn't make any sense. And I think that for me was almost the beginning of it, trying to understand this as a thing that actually happened.
Cole's sister stays in London to help during this period. And when he's on his journey to, I suppose, stop disaster happening and rescue his sister, he picks up another character along the way. Tell us about Ruth.
She's a bit of a mystery when you first meet her, and you gradually learn a little bit more of her as she opens up throughout the course of the quest, and they come to trust each other a bit more. You first of all discover that she is German, living in the UK. Then you gradually find out that she is German Jewish. And then she eventually explains to Cole that she is a Kindertransport refugee, and that she was sent from Germany a couple of years earlier to live in the UK without her parents, by herself. It was, I think, probably the part of the story that I did the most research for. I was lucky enough that I got in touch with an organisation called the Association of Jewish Refugees, who let me actually meet with and interview 3 original refugees, and to actually sit and listen to their experiences, but also to get to ask them questions. It's just completely, it was a real privilege. It was amazing.
Did you have any trepidation about putting that into a story which is a fantasy adventure as well as historical?
I absolutely did. I was so worried about it, because I think, the story of the Kindertransport happens before the Holocaust, but it is absolutely linked to it. The trajectory of it is there. And I think that I was very aware of the fact that bad writing about the Holocaust is really common, and it really does a disservice to it. And also, I thought, culturally, this is talked about so much and so badly, and I'm not Jewish. I don't really feel that this is something that I should be putting in my book about imaginary friends. And I think the thing that changed my feelings about it was there have been a couple of polls that have come in over the last couple of years, and what they're revealing is that not just young people, but chiefly young people do not know about the Holocaust. I don't know how it happened. The only explanation I can think of is that we all feel like it's just such a given that parents think that schools are talking about it and schools think that parents are talking about it. But it's resulted in the fact that young people, teenagers, 20-somethings, don't know about the Holocaust. And I think that was the thing that made me realise, no, this needs to be talked about and it needs to be written about.
Can I just ask you before we leave this little bit, did you, with the 3 survivors, the refugees that you spoke to, did they know that you were going to write the book, and were they able to offer you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I'd sort of explained a little bit about my book, and I think the thing that was most useful for me was just to hear about their experiences, because I knew already, I suppose, you can't really compare them, but in the same way that children being evacuated in the UK, some people had really amazing experiences and some people didn't. And for a lot of Kindertransport refugees, it was the same. Some of them felt very positively about coming here, and some of them didn't have such a nice experience. And I think I wanted to try and feel how that could fit into Ruth's story, because she has a uniformly bad experience. It was interesting to hear their thoughts on that, even to help sort of work out some kind of irregularities in terms of stuff that I'd written about how she felt about things. And I think that for me, the biggest surprise of all was, I guess when I went into writing this, I was, doing it in quite a sort of, at the time, the Dubs Act had been thrown out at Parliament, refusing refugee children from Syria to have easy transport here. And I felt very, very, very angry about it. And I think it was actually quite eye-opening talking to 3 women in their 90s who had gone through this. And whereas I was all fire and brimstone and it's disgusting that this is being turned down, the thing that really struck me was that they were actually just against any kind of divisiveness at all. And they felt very positively about the British government. They were very grateful for everything that had been done. because if it hadn't, then the grand likelihood is that they wouldn't have been there talking to me.
Mm. The time frame of the novel is sort of punctuated by articles from newspapers. And I wanted to know whether those were genuine articles. Have you got these from the archives, or have you just written them yourself?
They're all real. It was bonkers. It was one of the last things I did was I suddenly realized, like, oh, there's still quite a lot of heavy lifting exposition in these chapters. And it's my least favorite thing about historical fiction. I just hate it. Sort of characters going, have you seen that on today's date, the something, 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 the following things have happened? And I suddenly realized, hang on, like if each sort of section of this book is a new day, then I can use it as chapter headings. And, maybe I think at first I wanted like a collage of headlines. And I thought, that just clears that up. That's brilliant. And I went to the British Library and found the newspapers from those days. And I just couldn't believe it. It was like, it's just such a gift. I did have to rewrite quite a lot of things and squidge articles together purely for copyright reasons, but they're all based very much on real articles.
Mm-hmm. When you were going through the archives, what was your most amazing discovery?
So the final draft of the book was handed in February this year, before any proper impact of coronavirus on the UK. And then I basically had to get those sort of articles sort of almost in between sort of lockdowny moments. And I just couldn't believe like the comparison of looking at, how do people respond to this enormous thing that happens nationwide? Everybody is having to like deal with the same problem. The newspaper coverage was just identical. It was amazing. I loved the fact that, one of the things I wanted to talk about in this book is that when we talk about the Second World War in Britain, we paint it as a little bit of a sort of golden age that, everyone knew right from wrong and everyone knew what they were doing. And I don't believe that is true. And it was just really reassuring to see all these headlines of people not following the rules, not following the guidelines, not following blackout, just refusing to do it because they were like, I don't want to do this. Why should I? It was genuinely reassuring to see that people back then were not necessarily better people because, situations like that don't happen that easily.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're not looking back to a past that was morally perfect, and we might not be in a spiral of decline. I'll take from that.
Exactly.
But I do want to look at the other strand of this story that, as you say, you've woven them together. But let's talk first of all about this strand, which is to do with mythology, because it's not a straight historical story. There is some mythic work going on here too that kind of mirrors the power struggle in the real world, doesn't it?
That sort of balancing, actually, it wasn't really there in the first draft. My editor said, at the moment you've got a boy on this race to get to London, and along the way, lots of these, mythical folklore characters are popping up, but he needs to be pursued. There needs to be like some kind of antagonist in there. And I think that was the seed for putting in the characters of the sort of evil Midwinter King, who's the Lord of all darkness, but also the sort of Green Man, and sort of building in this sense of almost like an annual seasonal battle between sort of light and darkness and life and death, those kind of things.
It's interesting. The Green Man, I've always thought of as quite an ambivalent character, or an amoral character, neither good nor bad, but you put him against the Midwinter King and he's obviously the goody in this story.
I definitely, I have done a little bit of playing around with stuff. When I was researching that, the general feedback was those stories, they're incredibly changeable. And you get the same story in region after region after region, and everywhere's a little bit different. So you're given quite a lot of poetic license. I think when I first wrote the character, the Green Man, he was way more ambivalent. And when Cole, surprise, surprise, ends up encountering him, his attitude towards death, for example, is perhaps what you would expect from a creature that has lived for millennia and millennia. But I maybe have a tendency of making things a little bit too dark. So we shied away from that.
Mm. Okay, the Midwinter King then. There's a bit that I love, which is it's a chapter called The Midwinter King's Horse. It stands alone really nicely as a brilliant visual chapter, and I wondered if you could read that for us.
Yes, I certainly could. At this point in the story, the Midwinter King has decided to start pursuing Cole and his guardians on their journey. And he's just entered our world, the real world, and made a connection with Cole. He raised his arms, slow and incontestable, like the hands of some dreadful clock, and waited. Nothing happened at first. Then the snow melted beneath him. The soil began to turn. Worms writhed from the ground at his feet, like a tongue in a gagging mouth. Something was rising out of the undergrowth, tumbling from the darkness like foam. Bones. Hundreds of them, dragged from the earth and forming a shifting cloud in the valley. They came together, scraping and rasping against each other, creating something new and terrible in the last of the moonlight. It was a horse, and it was made of bones. All four legs ended in a human skull, their teeth clamping into the earth. Its face was a cluster of ribs and fingers. It turned to its master, and it waited. The Midwinter King mounted the horse and glanced at the sky. He only had a few hours of riding left. He could not stay outside like this when daylight came. The power of the sun would burn him like acid. But he could not go back to the spirit world either. He would have to find a way to hide himself until night returned. But it did not matter. It would not take long to catch up with the Guardians. They could not outrun him now. For who can outrun darkness? The Midwinter King rode south out of the valley, and he took the storm with him.
I tell you, I love that bit of the horse being made, the worms and the coming up from the earth. It put me in mind of a scene from Jason and the Argonauts, but it's the story of the teeth of the Hydra that get scattered and they turn into these skeletons. Do you like that film?
This was one of the first VHSs that I ever had. I rewatched Jason and the Argonauts recently, and those bits, the monsters, they're all like Ray Harryhausen clay animation, and the skeletons in particular, it still looks incredible.
Yeah. There's a little quote which I think in some ways can stand in for the whole novel. A single match could burn down a forest if you let it. And then later, there's an exchange between the King of Rogues and Cole when he comes to realise that this kind of very fearless, if you like, character is there because it's somebody that he's created out of his own mind. And he said that kind of strength comes at a price. He suddenly realizes that. And it seems to me that part of this book is about exploring power, how power can be misused, how it can be overcome, but also this other side of it, that it comes at a price and that you're a loser too if you have complete power.
It definitely, I think Catherine Rundle wrote a short essay, Why You Should Read Children's Books. It's something like that. Apologies for getting it. I've definitely got it wrong. But there's an amazing bit where she basically explains that children have the least agency of any type of people in the world. And so when you write for children, what you're really writing for is for everyone. They're the most sort of egalitarian books that there are because you're writing for the most powerless people. And so I think that in every single book, I do want to explore that. You know, if you send a character on a quest, you're giving them, you know, this responsibility and this power of their own destiny and their ability to do something that perhaps nobody else is able to do or can do. But I think that I chiefly write for children who are at that sort of top end of middle grade, when you're maybe 11 or 12 years old, and you're sort of on the cusp of things changing and on the cusp of almost beginning that path into becoming an adult. And actually learning to have responsibility and learning what that means takes years, and it can be a frightening thing. And I think that children know that, even if they can't vocalize it and they can't express it and they don't understand it, you know deep down a lot of the time what's going on. You only realize it later.
I've picked out what for me is a strong theme. Themes are very personal. Readers take different things from books. What do you see as being the overriding themes in your story?
It's the weirdest thing with writing a book is that sometimes afterwards you go, oh wait, I was supposed to do that and I forgot to do it. And there was something that a friend's father said a few years ago that I just thought was incredible and has really genuinely helped me. He said, things are never as good as you remember them being, but they're never as bad as you fear they are. And I think at the heart of it, I wanted to write about that. I think on the one hand, I wanted to write a story that was sort of set during a period of time that people can slightly glorify a little bit. But I also think that we happen to be in a period of time where it's been very, very easy over the last few years to think of us as being, in some respects, in a bit of a tricky position. But I think that the solution is kind of always there. You don't realize that it's happening. And that's what makes all the difference. That when things feel like they're at a lowest ebb, they're already in the process of changing and being fixed. And I found that incredibly comforting.
That is a fantastic thought to leave us on, Ross. It will leave us uplifted, ready for the Christmas holidays. People will be snuggling in front of their fires if they have them. And I suspect they'll be reading The Midnight Guardians. Thank you so much for joining me in the Reading Corner today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for amazing questions.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.